other institutions. And she and I, another fellow biomedical engineer, we had the opportunity to organize a session together in a national summit on biomedical engineering education. And I got to see then, and have continued to see over the years, just how much she brings an original thought and innovation in the space that Dr. lives. And just how much she brings to thinking about how you look at systems and infrastructure and how that plays out in the world. So I wanted to share with you a couple of my key takeaways from the book. And one of them that I thought was really important, that Deb asked the question. Better? So Deb asked the question, what might our world look like if access to these infrastructure systems were universal? And these are the kinds of questions that I've asked throughout my whole career, particularly as I did research in sickle cell disease, but also doing work looking at engineering solutions to health disparities. So thinking about how we have impact in the world is really important. Deb also, speaking of impact, she forces us to think about the implications, the consequences of the systems, of the structures, and our work. And I think it's really important for us to consider that as we go through in our education and also in our practice of engineering. And then finally, I wanted to say to you to think about this. Alicia told you a bit about our ceremonial welcome of the first class or entering class as part of Convocation. But I want you to think about Convocation not just as your welcome into the higher ed community and into Olin. I want you to think about it as a call to action. What are we going to do moving forward? How are we going to have impact? And we are so fortunate to be able to start this year in this Convocation with Deb and having her discuss in more detail what motivated her for the book and some of the key findings. So I want to have you think about that as we go into conversation. I want to thank all of those who were responsible for putting this program together, and of course the class of 2006 with their gift. And without further ado, please, I'd like to turn it over to Deb. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Gilda. Everyone can hear me, right? Thanks, Gilda. Thanks, Alicia. I know there's a huge amount of work that goes into an event like this, and I really appreciate it. And of course, it is a delight to stand here in front of my own community. I was actually thinking that the only Olin students that I actually don't know are the sophomores and the first years, because I've met every other Olin student who's come through. So I'm sure we'll have a chance to cross paths today and over the next 3 or 4 years, depending on what you are. So, I think my mic is still also being a little tweaky. Let me move it over here and see if it's a pickup issue. Does that sound okay? If it cuts out, I'll switch to a hand mic, but I think hopefully it'll be okay. I like using the whole space. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, this is me. This is a photo taken of me by a friend of mine because we spent a long weekend, 3 days, walking the 51-mile length of the LA River. So that's me with my pack. So I wrote this book, How Infrastructure Works, and it really focuses specifically on technological systems. And you can see a bunch of them in this photo. You can see stormwater, you can see electrical systems, you can see, if you look really carefully, there's some shipping containers over there on the left-hand side. You can see transportation. You cannot really see telecommunications, but of course I have a phone in my pocket that we're using for navigation, and also things like weather reports on this extremely non-LA looking LA day. So I really love this quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, the science fiction author, about what technology is. So she says, that it's not high tech, it's not computers, right? She says the technology is how a society copes with its physical reality, right? To how people get and keep and cook food, how they clothe themselves, what their power sources are, what they build with and what they build. This feels like it's really loud. Okay. And this is my favorite ever definition of technology, that technology is the active human interface with the material world. And one of the reasons why I'm starting with this is because engineering students, I think it is important to not lose sight of this. So my focus, as I said, was these sort of physical infrastructural systems. And this is the very, very first reservoir that was built for New York City. It's the new Croton Dam. Actually, this is actually built on top of the very first one. The new Croton Dam that's upriver on the Hudson. And I'm going to very, very briefly talk about like how these infrastructural systems work. So I think of water as kind of the canonical example, because if you have a bunch of people who live close together, they all need water every day, so they have to get that water from somewhere. If you have a bunch of people who live close together, the issue of how clean their water is gets kind of worse, right? So this becomes sort of more and more urgent and acute. And so many communities over the course of like literally thousands of years have figured out that what you should do is you should get together and you should build something that brings water to where you are, right? Aqueducts, reservoirs, and the like, because if you can cooperate to build those systems, water flows downhill, everybody needs water every day, right? That these collective systems will make everyone's life a lot easier for a long time in the future to come. So it takes advantage of the fact that these are networks, it takes advantage of the fact that people are working together, they are intrinsically collective, and they are intrinsically about people working together to make sort of a better future for everyone. And water in particular is really a public good, because if the people, like, having access to clean water doesn't just mean that you and your family is less likely to get sick and you have the water. If everyone around you is also less likely to get sick, that will protect you as well. So it's like you benefit from other people having access to water. So there's a reason why we think of clean water as kind of the canonical example of an infrastructural system, but also an infrastructural system as a public good, as a thing that benefits all of us. And I'm not going to go into detail, but the other kinds, other types of infrastructural networks work in fairly similar ways. Make sure this mic is turned off. Okay. So this is Amartya Sen. He's a development economist, he's passed away, who studied some of the poorest communities in the world. And he made the case that we want money, whether it's income or wealth, not in general because they're desirable for their own sake, but because he describes them as admirable general purpose means for having more freedom to live the kinds of lives that we have reason to value, right? That the usefulness of wealth is not it for its own sake, but because of the things it lets us to do. So the substantive freedom it allows us to achieve. And I actually submit that for many of us, and certainly for all of us in this room, our individual agency to act in the world does not come from wealth per se, right? It comes from access to these collective systems. And they're what actually make it possible for us to not have to think about how to meet our most basic needs and so why we have agency in the world. And the thing I use an example of this is the thing that probably most of us very rarely think about is the fact that just having artificial light means that, like, we can do things when we want. So you can get up early, you can stay up late, you can be in a room that has no windows and still see everything, right? So, and in fact, actually, this is so well established that economists can use artificial light as a proxy for the development of a given region. So if you, basically, as soon as people have access to resources to meet their basic survival needs, like food and fuel for cooking, pretty much the first thing they do is buy artificial light. And so that means that if you follow an area over time, as it develops, you can see it getting brighter at night. So, because artificial light is kind of like pure agency, right? It's like you can do what you want when you want to do it. And so it's one of the key bits of having collective networks that allow us to have things like artificial light, but even not thinking about where your drinking water comes from, or are you going to stay warm, right? All of this is what enables us to do everything else besides meet our basic survival needs. We do it mostly together through these collective systems. So over the course of the last 150 years or so, these systems got big and they got global. right? So they all basically now have essentially spanned the globe. If you think about things like telecommunications, if you think about things like cell phones, like mobile phones, that are pretty much everywhere. Nearly every human has at least some access to mobile phones. So we are now kind of embedded in these networks, and these networks are basically the size of our planet. And we benefit from them. They bring the resources to where we are and to where we use them. I want to highlight one in particular, because I'm going to come back to this, which is shipping containers are what made it possible to essentially basically drop the cost of shipping goods so much that it's why most of the goods we use today are not produced near where we live, right? Because it's now possible, it's actually inexpensive to make things anywhere and then ship it to where it's used. These are actually the newest container cranes at Boston. So these basically went in 2 years ago, 3 years ago, at the freight terminal in Boston. Boston, by the way, by American standards, has a very, very small shipping terminal. If you're from someplace like Los Angeles, you know what a really big one looks like. So, you know, the thing about being an engineering professor is that I definitely think less about economics and I definitely think more about energy. So all of the things that we do, so like light and transportation and telecommunications, all of these things require energy. And so as these systems got bigger and as they went global, so you look at those shipping containers, right, and how much energy it takes to move around, there has been this sort of corresponding increase in the amount of energy we use, not just as individuals, but collectively and as a species. And so this is the real change in the last sort of 200 or so years, is you can see the rise in, the total curve is the amount of energy we use, and then you can see the breakdown of the different things. So traditional biomass is things like burning wood, and then you can see that it's not like that went away, but you can see coal came in first, and then oil, and then gas, and then you can see at the top the solar, wind, hydropower, nuclear that are still fairly small. These data tend to lag actual data, so this is 2019. I suspect it's changed pretty substantively, even in the last 5 years. But this is this sort of almost exponential increase in the amount of energy that we get to use as a species. And more than money, it's energy that actually enables us to do what we want. So like energy is how you pay for it, but if you're an engineering student, you know that energy is a true currency of the material world. So this is not a graph of GDP, right? This is a graph of per capita energy usage. And so it's color-coded. And you can see that where the dark regions are, I actually grew up in Canada. So Canada is slightly colder and bigger than the US, but it has a very similar standard of living. So the per capita energy usage in Canada is a little higher than it is in the US. And so you can sort of see the sort of different colors of where do people use energy and where do they not use energy. And this really gets back to that idea that most of how we use energy is through these collective systems, right? Very little of it is just like, oh, making sort of individual choices. And so that actually is partly why it's so hard to move the needle on climate change as an individual, because you're not like, it's like, I drive to work because there isn't good public transit options. If there were, I would do that instead. Most of our energy choices are constrained by the systems, the collective systems that we're embedded in. So on the one hand, they make our lives as we know it possible, right? We walk in and we flip on the light switch. On the other hand, we are kind of constrained to like, where is that energy coming from? So this is a graph of sort of, or a map of sort of energy usage, that energy use is collective, but also that energy usage really depends on where you live, right? The infrastructure, it's the first thing we notice when you go different places, is like, what kind of infrastructure is there? So it's really sort of locally shaped. So if we put these two things together, we all kind of know the consequences of the fact that most of our energy comes from fossil fuels and how much energy that we're using both as a species and as individuals, and particularly if you live in developed countries. Thank you, Teen Vogue. I want to actually highlight two things off this, right? So there's the one thing that we always think about as climate change as actual climate change, right? That there's CO2 in the atmosphere, it's raising the temperature of the planet, and that's having a suite of effects, mostly kind of not unpredictable, but non-linear effects. But the other thing I want to say is that our infrastructural systems move, they're networks that are embedded in the landscapes, right? They move resources to where we are, to where we use them, and they're taking resources from somewhere else or moving the harm somewhere else. those networks now are embedded in the landscape, and as the landscapes are changing, that means that those networks are going to be affected, right? So if you built these networks assuming that the landscape is stable, and that's no longer true, even if you did a good job of designing and building them in the first place, you still can't use them the way that they were built, right? We still need to start rethinking how we use them. So this is kind of where we are, right? And probably, like this part of it, I think, is probably pretty sort of top of mind for everyone. But I want to this is literally the million-mile view of our planet. This is the Earth Observatory that's located at Lagrange Point 1 at L1, which is just about 1 million miles away from our planet. And when you look at the Earth at this point, there's two things you notice. So the first one is that the Earth is, in fact, awash in solar energy. And if you run the numbers, if every human on Earth used energy at the same per capita rate as those energy-guzzling Canadians, it would still only be a fraction of a percent of all of the solar energy, right? So like when we talk about renewable energy, this is what we mean, right? There is more energy than humanity at this point could conceivably use arriving on the planet every nanosecond of every second of every minute of every day, right? So this is the first thing that we need to do. So the thing that has really radically changed in the last 20 or so years is that for the first time in human history, we have figured out how to effectively harness that at scale. And we mostly did this through a huge combination of sort of regulation and policy. This is a wind farm in Palm Springs. Those windmills almost certainly look familiar to you. This is a Danish design that was developed by a sort of public-private partnership in Denmark. Because of that, they're widely available, right? And it turns out to be, like, after about a century of trying, there are now windmills that are incredibly reliable. And so that's why these are the most widely used design everywhere. Another thing that happened is, and this was actually very much led by the US, was policy commitments to get really good solar panels kind of out of the lab and into factories and then out into, literally, in the field. This is a solar farm. I took this photo at a solar farm outside Hyderabad in India. And so we're starting to see that we are now capable of getting energy, and that means getting the agency to act in the world, like our ability to do things in the world without having to pass through setting things on fire first, right? So basically going from renewable energy to the form in which we use it, like electricity, without passing through that stage of extracting fossil fuels and then transforming them into something else and then dumping the CO2 into the atmosphere. So that actually brings me to the second point that is evident when you look at this photograph, which is that the Earth is surrounded by the void of space, right? Like, barring the odd meteorite or spacecraft, nothing really comes in or out. It is a closed system. And what that means is that everything that we use, every physical atom, right, it has to come from somewhere, it has to go somewhere. So when we get energy from fossil fuels, we get it by taking the oil or the gas or whatever, burning it, getting the energy out, but also then we still have the same atoms left, right? So those atoms then basically get put somewhere else. And this is pollution, right? CO2 in the air. It's also microplastics in the ocean, right? It's like, stuff in landfills, this idea of like extraction, consumption, and then those atoms have to go somewhere. So the last time we got access to a large amount of energy, what we did with it was kind of this. So this is an aluminum smelter. Aluminum kind of famously takes an enormous amount of energy. It's extremely common, but it's bound, the aluminum atoms are bound so tightly to the oxygen that up until the 19th century, it was basically a precious metal. Nobody kind of realized, I mean, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of aluminum, but like silvery aluminum metal was so hard to come by that it was basically like more precious than silver. It's kind of like platinum. Because it took so much energy, and we had to figure out how to separate it out from the aluminum ore. But of course, that changed, right? Like the last time when we got access to energy, one of the things we did with it was use it to scale up aluminum production, and it went from being literally precious, like we're going to make a baby rattle for like the child of the emperor, into we're disposable, right? So I suspect that there's probably at least someone in this room who threw aluminum away today, right, already. So the last time we got access, so I said, renewable energy is this enormous amount of energy, and the last time we got access to that amount of energy, one of the major things we did with it was scale up our consumption of stuff, right? And scale up this idea we extract stuff and then we dump it someplace else. And in fact, aluminum is actually largely recycled because it takes so much energy to make it in the first place that it's worth kind of recycling it because it will take less energy to make the next one. I remember I said energy is a currency of the material world, right? It's economically viable to recycle aluminum. You know what? It's not economically viable to recycle because it takes too much energy. So we also took access to fossil fuels and access to energy to do things like plastics, and probably most people in this world, up in this room, are familiar with the idea of plastics being, I already mentioned microplastics in the ocean, the problems of landfill, the problems of recycling. However, get about that in a sec. Now that we have access to so much energy, we can do things that were previously economically inviable, i.e. energetically unfavorable, right? So we don't have to, we can actually, for the first time ever, kind of live within our planetary boundaries because our planetary boundaries are we have all the energy we want and we now know how to use it, right? And we live in this closed system for atoms, and if we apply one to the other, right, instead of taking the energy and using it to get more atoms out of the ground and then dump them someplace else, if we take that energy and we use it to start closing materials loops, right, that means that we can address this question of stuff, right, of atoms, of being in a closed system for atoms. We can just start treating the planet, instead of treating it like energy is scarce and matter is all over the place, whatever, right? We can go in the opposite direction and be like, energy is abundant, matter is scarce, right? Atoms are scarce, right? It's a closed system. Everything we use, we have to figure out how to reuse. And it is now viable in a way it's never been, but that does require us to think differently about this whole thing. So this is Ursula Franklin. She was a professor emerita at my alma mater at the University of Toronto. And she said, central to any new order that can shape and direct technology and human destiny, and what else are we talking about here, right? I'm like, this is unprecedented in human history. This is a new order to direct technology and human destiny. Will be a renewed emphasis on the concept of justice, right? That if we're like, we don't care where stuff comes from, we don't care where it goes, we don't care who's affected, that is the opposite of justice, right? Thinking about, well, we just care what we have. But if we actually bring this mindset to it, that is the thing that will shape this. So what does that look like? This is Dr. Atasha Cave, 06, the class that's actually supporting this. I actually taught Atasha in her first material science class, which is also my first material science class as a professor here at Olin, because she was in the first graduating class. And since then, she's done many things, but one of which was that she went and she did her PhD at Stanford, looking at catalysts for taking CO2, say, from the atmosphere, and turning it back into long chains, say, polymers or biofuels. And that takes an enormous amount of energy, but hey, we can get that energy from renewable sources now. So she is currently the CSO, one of the founders and the chief scientific officer of 12.co, that's the URL, which is a company that is currently building pilot plants to use geothermal energy to do exactly this, right? To basically take CO2 out of the air and turn it back into useful things. And of course, the best part is that then you can do it again and again, right? So we are just starting to see the beginning of this transformation, right? We have the energy, we have a whole bunch of smart people are figuring out, like, what can we do if we have this energy to close these materials loops, and it's beginning to happen. So that's a very straightforward, very instrumental, very engineering, what does this mean for you? I don't necessarily expect all of you to go do your PhD at Stanford and found companies. I imagine some of you will. But there is this larger question, which is that we live in a world that has been shaped entirely by one way of looking at these systems, right? We built out these systems thinking about, well, who benefits? We don't really care that much about who's harmed, right? They're somewhere else. That's why there's that big discrepancy on the graph about who uses energy and how. We are really good at bringing resources to where we use them. That's what these networks do. We're equally good at displacing harms to other people, right? Where it comes from, even CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Where other people are going to deal with the consequences of these systems. We know how to build a world that looks like this, right? We know how to build this inequitable world that's built around the idea that we only have so much energy and it's really expensive, and we don't worry about like mitigating harms. We're just okay with like other people dealing with the harms. And that's why I so stress this idea of we need a new mindset and we need a new justice. But this is the world that we live in today. It is not the world that we can live in 20, 50, 100 years. We don't know what that world looks like yet. We have never lived there, right? It is fully like terra incognita, right? What does a future look like when it's not governed by, inequities, when it's not governed by pollution, right? We now have the capacity to build infrastructural networks to use our energy in ways that are resilient, that are sustainable, but also that are equitable, right? And we kind of need to do this because we want our systems to stay functional, but we are still figuring out what that world is going to look like. And that means thinking about the future that we want to live in ourselves, right? Not just like looking at the future that other people give us. So this is, in the 1970s, NASA asked artists to make renderings of like what future space stations could look like. So this is a ring space station. You can see the stars in the background. I love it because it looks so much like Southern California, which is where the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is in the 1970s. This nice couple on their backyard drinking wine. You can see his like big 1970s lapels, right? It looks exactly like the present, only kind of transposed into the future. That is not the world that we want to live in. But we don't know what that world is going to look like. So I'm going to end, this is a quote from Grace Lee Boggs. She was a famous community organizer. She was not, as far as I know, focused on infrastructure, but this is an incredibly germane quote to where we are. She says, "The time has come for us to reimagine everything. We have to see every crisis as both a danger and an opportunity. The danger because it does so much damage to our lives, to our institutions, to all that we have expected." This is kind of how we think about climate change, right? It's like, it is a crisis, we need to fix this crisis. But, she says, it is also an opportunity for us to become creative, for us to become a new kind of people that are needed at such a huge period of transition. So this is where we are, right? And it's not just Olin students, this is where you are, it's where all of us are if you're alive today. And I'm going to end things there. It's our opportunity to become creative. Thank you.
I'm going to skip Q&A. I'm going to skip Q&A and send them to you at lunch. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I really want to, I am so torn. Right now, I really want to stay and do like an hour of Q&A and have a whole conversation about this. And I'm also really excited to sort of pick up exactly where Deb left off in the activities that we have planned for you. So I'm going to let that part of my tension win because a whole bunch of people, including Emily Anderson, Emily Andrews, as well as Maggie Anderson, Jamie Engel, Delaney Knapp, Sarah Spence-Adams, planned all this, and some of the students I mentioned earlier, Azzy. So I am going to send you off to your rooms. Everyone should have a ticket. If you don't have a ticket, please grab one from somewhere around. We're going to reconvene for lunch around 12:15. Sort of, hopefully you'll stagger yourselves so the lunch won't be so bad. Deb will be around at lunch and happy to answer questions. Deb is also around in our community. And so you can find her anytime, and she will be happy to talk to you all about infrastructure with great passion.
12:15? So I will be in the dining hall at 12:15. I am looking forward to seeing everything you do. Also, I have stickers, so come find me with questions and if you want a sticker.
Stickers. All right, go forth. Go to your rooms. Make haste. Thank you. It's like too similar. As soon as I said it, I was like, wrong line. Oh, that's